I call Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased to take a call on the Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill. And the Green Party is now very pleased to be able to support the bill. When it was first introduced, we opposed it because there were far too generous exemptions for building owners from meeting fire and disability access requirements when they were undertaking earthquake strengthening. And I pay tribute to submitters and my colleague Mojo Mathers who highlighted this and helped get these changes, because when the bill was introduced with those exemptions, again, it was saying that cost was too great a factor in making the changes to enable all people to have easy access to buildings, and it just reinforced the perceptions that the needs of older people and people with a disability didn't count for as much as the needs of others. And as often the case, the costs were overstated and the benefits of ensuring that buildings are accessible were understated. Accessible buildings have major benefits, not just for people in wheelchairs, but of course older people, parents and families with pushchairs. So it's with great pleasure that those changes have now been made, that we can support this bill. Because earthquakes are, of course, a major natural hazard in New Zealand. There have been 7 fatal earthquakes since 1840, with 473 people losing their lives, and of course 185 of those in Christchurch. So this bill is very important in improving public safety and reducing the risk of serious injury and death from earthquakes. And we've seen that also not just in Christchurch, obviously, but in Nepal, where more than 7,000 people were killed in the recent earthquakes there. And even though the Minister has noted that where people are 100 times more likely to die in a car accident and 50 times more likely to drown, the challenge is to improve the safety of our buildings, to reduce the risks to life and to reduce the risks of serious injury. And I think it's very important, Mr Speaker, that there is support across the House, because the costs of strengthening buildings will be considerable. There are thousands of building owners who are affected by this legislation, so the fact that there is cross-party support means that there will be certainty and an enduring regime, rather than one that changes as governments are changed. And we are very pleased to have been a part of the consideration of the major changes to this bill, which has ensured that it does get cross-party support, and very pleased with the process that both the current Minister, Dr Nick Smith, and the former Minister, Maurice Williamson, and the Select Committee undertook to respond to public submissions and to make the major changes in this bill that have resulted in the change to the one-size-fits-all approach that was in the bill as introduced, to one that recognises that seismic risk differs across the country. And like others, I commend the enormous work and the very constructive submissions from earthquake engineers, from councils, property owners, seismic experts, scientists, local councils, and Dr Anne Brower, the survivor of the building collapse on the Sumner bus in Christchurch. And I think, as Dr Brower has said, this bill has been democracy in action, with the Select Committee and with Government recognising that these non-structural features in unreinforced masonry buildings, like verandas, like parapets, like the facades, can be strengthened much more easily and cheaply than whole buildings, that they are the low-hanging fruit, that they exist on about 2,000 buildings across New Zealand, and that if we strengthen those, if we get rid of some of those parapets, that we significantly reduce the risk of injury and the risk to life. So the bill provides a process where councils will consult their communities on which unreinforced masonry buildings on major thoroughfares, major roads and the like should be classified as priority buildings and are a priority for strengthening. So that has been quite a significant change, which I don't think would have occurred if it hadn't been for Dr Brow's submissions and the submissions and advocacy also of the Mayor of Christchurch, the Honourable Leanne Dalziel. So this whole process with this bill and the release by the Select Committee of an interim report and the call for a second round of submissions on the departmental report and the changes that the committee was proposing to make are an example of very good lawmaking by this Parliament and a good process. And we'd encourage the Minister to adopt a similar process with other controversial legislation like the resource legislation bill, because it counts when people hear that their submissions and their suggestions of law changes are actually being picked up by Parliament, that this then becomes the people's house in reality and that we are making the people's law and responding to the concerns that are raised through that submission process. Mr Speaker, I think the change in the bill with the 3 seismic risk zones, high, medium and low, depending on the frequency of earthquakes which are likely to cause fatalities, the much more targeted approach that this embodies is a good one. And the change too to having priority buildings like emergency response buildings, education facilities where there are more than 20 people and hospitals, requiring those to be identified and strengthened in half the standard time is also a good one. A couple of the current gaps though are in regulations. There was of course very limited information in the bill, and it's not appropriate that it be in primary legislation, about the methodology that's to be used to identify, assess and remediate earthquake-prone buildings. That level of technical information is more appropriately put in regulations. But because some councils like Wellington are getting on and identifying earthquake-prone buildings, are working out how they are going to assess those, the regulations need to be developed sooner rather than later. MB has said that it's going to consult with stakeholders, and we'd like to see that work given priority so that there is consistency across New Zealand in the methods that councils and building owners use to assess buildings and identify them. The other area is in regard to taxation, and there's a problem in our tax law in relation to building strengthening that needs to be fixed. And the Minister has said that he thought it was premature to address tax reforms while the bill was at Select Committee. He said that he's acutely aware of the potential fiscal impacts to building owners, but this needs to be fixed because under the current law, as I understand it, building owners cannot claim tax deductibility or depreciation for assessments of earthquake proneness, nor for the remedial work that they take to ensure that a building complies with the law. And yet they can claim tax deductibility if a building collapses and if it kills or injures people potentially. So that doesn't make sense when they can claim deductibility for the worst of those issues and not for the strengthening. So the Green Party believes that we need this issue to be looked at by a taxation working party and there to be some incentives for building owners, such as tax deductibility for the costs of strengthening. We also need a look at the issue around depreciation for work on heritage buildings. Because in Wellington, for example, there are over 700 earthquake-prone buildings and 183 of these are listed heritage buildings. While the council can offer rates relief, there is no tax relief available to building owners for their upgrading work. And if we make some changes to tax law here, it would better recognise the quite substantial contribution which these heritage buildings make to our sense of place in towns and cities around New Zealand and to the character that they provide. It would recognise the community benefit from retaining these buildings. So, Mr Speaker, these tax law changes, the Minister said he would look at them once the legislation is passed. We hope that that is sooner rather than later, but we do commend this bill and the changes it makes, and the Green Party is pleased to support it.